What I'd like to do on this video is to talk about the rapture and of the church and how many people differ by simply saying what are the basic differences and how do people argue for their position. I think it's only fair to get a total picture of what people are saying, and that is my purpose. I think it's unfortunate often that one position is presented as the final truth, and scholars actually differ. And I think it's only fair that people are able to see the differences and then decide for themselves what they believe. And I think the important thing is the Lord is coming back. And all the details of timing in that regard, people may differ. But the good news is he's coming back. But let me just share real quickly a passage that has spawned a lot of different interpretations. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, it reads, "For this we say to you, by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who remain around unto the parousion, to Kyriou, that is, unto the arrival of the Lord, shall not precede those who have fallen asleep, that is, those who have already died. Because the Lord with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God shall descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ shall be raised first. Then we who are living, who remain around, shall be snatched up." And the word in the Greek here, harpagesamata, from harpagadzo, to snatch up, shall be snatched up in the clouds unto, and the word here, apantesin, unto a meeting of the Lord in the air. What is interesting here, harpazo meaning to snatch up. First of all, this is where we get the idea of rapture from the Latin. And so we have raptio, to snatch up. It is interesting that when this text is interpreted, there are different interpretations. And I would like to briefly give the different interpretations. One that is very common, and you hear it most of the time, is that Christ is coming back for the church. The church will be raptured and caught up and will reside in the air with Christ for 7 years, at the end of which is called the tribulation period, Christ then will return with his church to earth. And those who hold that position believe there will be a 1,000-year millennial reign upon earth, followed by a new heaven and new earth. And with that point of view, there are a number of judgments. One having to do with the church being judged at the right hand, or being judged in what we call the judgment seat of Christ. Then the judgment when Christ returns, and the judgment at the end of the millennium, which that position would argue would be mainly non-believers. Believers being judged at the judgment seat of Christ. That's the most popular position in evangelical teaching today. It has not always been, though, the popular position. When we look at church history and we look at the creeds, the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, etc., the idea is Christ is coming back and there will be a general resurrection followed by a general judgment. So how do people that hold that viewpoint treat the rapture? Well, first of all, let me say there is a second way that the rapture is treated, and that is in what is called a post-tribulational premillennial position. That is, Christ is coming back after the tribulation period, a future tribulation period, in which there would be, at that point, a millennial reign on earth, where martyrs would reign with Christ. And those who hold that position believe the rapture is the welcoming party to meet the Lord when he comes back at his parousia, to welcome him and to then come back with him to earth to begin his reign upon the earth for 1,000 years. So in that regard, the rapture is the welcoming party. Then we have a third point of view, and that is the point of view of either a post-millennial or amillennial. We could say a third or fourth point of view. Both would agree, though, relative to the rapture. Post-millennial theology would teach that the church will bring in the millennium, and Christ will then come after the church does that to reign. And there will be a final general resurrection, a final general judgment. And how would they have treated the rapture? I believe, again, as a welcoming party, that the church would welcome the king when he comes back to begin the judgment, followed by a new heaven and new earth. Amillennial theology does not believe in a 1,000-year millennial reign either. It differs from post-millennial theology in that it believes that things will get worse, not better. And at the end of time, Christ will come back, and the church again will be the welcoming party, that being the rapture in amillennial theology. Christ is coming back. The church then will be raised to welcome him. Those who have died will be raised first, and then those who are alive will be snatched up to meet the Lord in the air when he returns. And so, as we look at the idea of rapture, post-millennial theology, amillennial theology, and can we say post-millennial theology all agree in one particular, and that is that the rapture is simply the welcoming party. When in Rome, for example, one would return from a campaign, people would often go out to meet that returning, let's say, person, and they then would accompany him back to Rome, back to the city of Rome. So the word can have that meaning as a welcoming party. And it's interesting when we look at the book of Matthew, for example, we have the big question in Matthew 13 about the wheat and the tares. And in that, Jesus makes a very interesting statement about his return. Notice he says in verse 41, in interpreting that parable, the Son of Man will send forth his angels and gather all things that stumble out of his kingdom and those that do lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. But notice right before that, he describes how the Lord is going to come. At the end of time, we are told that the Son of Man is going to come. And the question was asked, what will be, how do we think about the future? And Jesus said there's two ages, ha'olam haya, ha'olam haba, the age that is to come. In the age that is to come, we enter the final kingdom of Messiah. And he talks about how at that time, he's going to send out the reapers, and they're going to separate wheat from tares. And at that point, he will then be able to start that eternal kingdom, where they who are the tares will be judged and cast into the furnace of fire. They who are the righteous will actually shine as the sun in the kingdom. And here, those who argue for the amillennial or postmillennial point of view would say that we believe there's one general coming and one general day of judgment and one general resurrection. And that Jesus is speaking of that here. It's sort of like at harvest time, the tares are rooted out. And so those who hold to postmillennial and amillennial theology would say, why would we have tares continuing for 1,000 years? Then there is a passage that is appealed to, and that is in Matthew chapter 25, where again the Lord returns, and in verse 31, as he returns, he will come, the Son of Man, in his glory again, and all the angels with him. Then will he sit upon his glorious throne. And there will be this separation again of the sheep and the goats. And so those who then hold to this, to the position of amillennial or postmillennial theology would say the same teaching by the Lord. In the one, it's wheat from tares, and the other, it's sheep from goats, and it all is talking about the final day of judgment, paralleling what Jesus taught when he said, all who are in the tombs will hear my voice and come forth. General resurrection in John 5, they would argue. Some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. In other words, there is that separation again. And all the way through the teaching of Jesus, the amillennial and postmillennial theologian would say Jesus clearly is teaching one general resurrection and one general judgment. And it's a repetition, which is part of Semitic thinking, repeating. And then, furthermore, then, how do they understand the rapture? It would be the same as a, let's say, a historic premillenarian. That is, one who believes that Christ is coming before the millennium and the church is the welcoming party. They would simply see again the rapture as the welcoming party, except the millennium would already have been fulfilled when the martyrs reign with Christ according to an Augustinian view from the resurrection of Christ to the second advent. So in either case, whether it's amillennial, postmillennial, we are thinking of the same idea, those who hold to that position, and that is basically the church is the welcoming party at the rapture. There is a rapture, but it's not as the pre-tribulational point of view would hold, before the tribulation, and the church then is in heaven until the end of it, but it is a point of view that believes that the church will welcome Christ at his return. In that regard, it would agree with the, can I say, the historic premillennial position that Christ would come before the millennium, and there would be a millennium, and it would be after the tribulation, the church would be the welcoming party. All those positions would see the rapture as the welcoming party. They would differ relative to the millennium. And again, those who hold to an amillennial position or a postmillennial would say Jesus said nothing about wheat and tares after that final judgment. The tares were rooted out. Or after the sheep and the goat judgments, the goats are rooted out, so to speak. And so in light of that then, the reading of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 by those who would not hold to a pre-tribulational rapture believe that the church is simply the welcoming party, going out to meet the king the eternal emperor as he's coming back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The amillennial and the post-millennial point of view would also believe that there is only one resurrection, not two, not one at the beginning of the millennium and one at the end, but one resurrection. And they would argue and say that we believe is what Jesus teaches when he said, all who are in the tombs will hear my voice and come forth, and giving a summary of the resurrection. And then finally, the final day of judgment that would occur. And so we ask the question then, what is the rapture? According to millennial and premillennial theologians, and even, like I said, historic premillennial and amillennial and postmillennial, it is simply a welcoming party. The positions will differ, though, in terms of the whole idea of judgments. There's only one general judgment in post-millennial and amillennial theology. In premillennial, there's two, one at the beginning and one at the end. And so I wanted to just give an overall summary of the different positions and the arguments for it. Those who argue for the amillennial position would simply say, you know, as I read Jesus, there doesn't seem to be time for the tares to hang around. The judgment seems to be when Christ returns with his angels, same way with the sheep and the goats. In light of that, they would then interpret Revelation 20 as far as the millennial question, as Augustine did, that the martyrs are now reigning with Christ. See, 1,000 is a symbolic number from the resurrection to the second advent of Jesus Christ. So I wanted to just share quickly those different viewpoints so that people can think through them on their own and come to a position. And I don't think the Lord is 100% hung up on what position a person comes to. But I think it's fair to see how godly people have differed and why. And so often today, we only hear one perspective. And I believe that what I wanted to do on this video, and it's probably already been done many times, is to share the different perspectives and to define again what the rapture is. For those who hold to the amillennial and postmillennial position, the rapture is simply the welcoming party to meet the final, can I say, King of Kings, as he is coming back to establish the final resurrection, general resurrection, and the final general judgment. And they would hold the same teaching relative to the rapture as those that hold to Christ coming after the tribulation period, but who believe in an earthly millennial reign. The rapture would be interpreted in the same way. The church is simply the welcoming party. I wanted to lay out those different viewpoints. Thank you so much.